Another dire warning from scientists about the ticking climate time bomb, this time drawing a direct link between environmental damage and human health.
Powerful Category 4 storm Maria is hitting with 155
Overnight, the sprawl
mile-an-hour
of more
winds.
than 500 California wildfires
Dense
surged
and
in a
dirty.
relentless
A
march
gigantic
of
dust
flames.
cloud
in the
nicknamed
Amazon
Godzilla.
rainforest, because new official figures show the situation is getting worse and that this July has had more fires than last July did.
Chapter 5, Earth Overshoot Day. If you do care about the planet, if you do care that this is something important for us all to partake in, we need to take a really strong look at our justice system and our civil rights system, because it is completely unacceptable that these lower income communities and communities of color are facing so many environmental problems from people who deny that it even exists. The year is 2020. There's a pandemic that shut down the entire world. There's fires raging all over California. There's a heat wave that's seeding panic in Japan. There's tons of floods in China, India, and Ireland that's devastating cities. There's stronger than average and normal tropical storms all over the East Coast. And I am confident that we are going to be experiencing this year horrifying blizzards as we did in the previous years. As of July 23rd, 2020, there have been more than 207 natural disasters in the world. I wanted to take an opportunity today to talk about Earth Overshoot Day. This year, Earth Overshoot Day landed on August 22nd. Earth Overshoot Day, for those of you who don't know, is a day that signifies when the planet has actually used up all of its resources that it could possibly replenish within 1 year. What does that mean? It means that anything that we use, any resource at all that we use after today, or August 22nd, I should say, is being taken from future generations. Now, if you've listened to this show before, you know I am a huge advocate for sustainability, environmentalism, and just general taking care of our planet. And I wanted to speak about Earth Overshoot today, not only because it just happened recently, but because I feel like it's a very important topic to discuss. However, I believe that there's something much more vital for us to partake in a conversation before we can even begin to talk about environmentalism. And that is social justice, because environmental justice cannot happen without social justice. For those of you who don't know, I'm Farhanah, your host, and welcome to this special episode of Earth's Narrative. And for the returning listeners, thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. Today I'm not going to have a guest because the guest that I would like to highlight can't actually speak for herself. The chapter that I want to add in this story of Earth's narrative is actually one of Mother Nature. Mother Nature has given us everything. I mean, she is the mother, you know? And we don't respect her, but how can we? In the last few months, our country has been going through devastating turmoil. Not only because of a pandemic and a lockdown that has shoved millions of people below the poverty line and forcing millions out of their homes and out of their lifestyles, but because we as a country have had to face and contend with the broken social systems that we have. And no, I'm not just talking about the lack of health care, the lack of job security, and the lack of social services to support our communities. But I'm talking about the very obvious racism that occurs in this country every single day. With the shooting of Jacob Blake last week, it was very apparent. I mean, it should have already been apparent before, from George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, and the countless of others who have lost their lives to police brutality. But Jacob Blake's shooting really struck me, because after George Floyd, there were so many protests all over the country. People were vehemently angry, and they were justifiably, might I add, but they were also hurt. And it felt like the country was at a turning point. I mean, you have Republicans like Mitt Romney marching on the streets of Washington, and the Black Lives Matter movement really made news, and it gotten the traction and coverage that it so desperately needed for years. And I'm so thankful for all the activists that have been working so diligently all these years in order to get to this point. But it was so depressing to see that even after all of that, nothing had changed. A man was shot in broad daylight on the back 7 times, and we're still contesting whether or not those cops should get charged. And this is just one example of the systemic oppression and racism that people of color, and especially the African American community, faces every single day. I have some stats for you guys about the environmental justice that is not being served in these communities, and I'd like to read them for you. In America, 70% of the country's contaminated waste sites or Superfund sites are located near low-income housing. 40% of people who live critically close to hazardous chemical facilities are Black or Latino. And Black people are exposed to 50% more air pollution than white people. And this is just America. When you start to look at statistics of just the environmental degradation in developing nations, it starts to become much more apparent the environmental racism that is exploited in all of these people. One such occurrence I can just think off of the top of my head is the Shell oil spill in Nigeria. When the Shell oil spill in Nigeria happened, Shell didn't really face any repercussions except for a fine that could be considered production costs or something. It was just a slap on the hand for them, and that was it. But what was the result of it? All of that oil spilled into Nigeria's watersheds and rivers. That is one of the only freshwater sources for the natives that lived in that land, and therefore it was completely polluted. I mean, this isn't just something that happens in Nigeria, but it happens in developing nations all over the world. You have companies like Nike and Disney that are contributing to fast fashion, and they use exploitive labor in developing nations like Bangladesh, Haiti, and so on. And not only do they use this labor, but they also have waste sites. There's a small village in Indonesia where Nike actually uses the facilities to burn their shoes. And their shoes, it emits very toxic fumes that therefore poison the children. Statistically, those kids are more likely to be born with some sort of birth defect than if they were to be away from those sites and areas. And of course, it's usually the poor people. It always is the poor people. I mean, Linkin Park had a very good quote that I can think of. It's, when the rich wage war, it's the poor who die. And this is so true. But why are these people poor? We have to think about. I don't really want to get into why you should care about the planet, because at this point, there's so much information out there. There's news reports, there's athletes and celebrities talking about it, politicians, there's Netflix documentaries. Every single person has access to all of this information. And if you still believe that climate change is not real, then there's nothing that I can say that will change your mind. And if you do believe it's real, but you don't think that it is important for us to protect our environment, then there's also nothing I can say that will change your mind. Ooh, I just heard a honk. What I will say, though, is that if you do care about the planet, if you do care that this is something important for us all to partake in, we need to take a really strong look at our justice system and our civil rights system. Because it is completely unacceptable that these lower income communities and communities of color are facing so many environmental problems from people who deny that it even exists. I wanted to speak candidly with all of you today simply because I'm hurt and distraught at seeing the state that our country is in. Not that it's never been this way, but now it's just very in your face and apparent. And it's so distressing for me to see people still ignore it. When we think about environmentalism, we think about how can I be more sustainable? How can I find wellness in my life? And those are all great endeavors, but it's also been co-opted by the wealthy white communities. If you think about wellness now, one of my biggest triggers is the yoga community. I mean, yoga came from India, and people used to make fun of us all the time for participating in these body stretches that is supposed to help you in your world alignment. But now it is seen as something that is of an upper class hobby. I mean, you go and take yoga classes that you have to spend money on and blah, 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 whatever. Great. I'm not saying that you shouldn't partake in yoga, but also because of this, and that's just one example, it takes away from lower income communities that aren't able to access the same resources. The same thing goes with thrifting. Thrifting was intended for people who simply could not afford to buy new fashion or new clothing that costed like hundreds of dollars or even $80, $90. Like I would never ever spend $90 on a jacket. I just couldn't see the point in that. However, thrifting has been taken and redispersed and gentrified as this, new hip thing that is very expensive now. If you look at online stores and those new thrift boutiques and things, their prices are not accessible to the majority of communities. They're just not. So we vilify people for not being able to participate or be sustainable in their own ways. But then we also exclude these very same communities from interacting with the environment in the same way. I've talked about this before, but it is important for our health and our mental state of mind to actually be in the natural world constantly. I mean, we are animals at the end of the day, and we need to be in nature. We need to be at the beaches. We need to go on a walk at the park. We need to be outside. I mean, remember when everybody was in a lockdown and we had to stay inside? How crazy did everybody get? And the sight of a tree made everyone so happy and feel like, okay, this feels good. If you look at inner city dwellings, though, they have almost no parks, less access to beaches and natural areas. It's all just an urbanized jungle. I mean, I work in these areas fairly often, and it's so easy for me to see the disparity in the resources that's allocated to these areas and not to other areas like Santa Monica, Brentwood, or other more affluent cities in Los Angeles. So not only are these places food deserts, they have less access to organic foods, healthier options, but they also have less access to parks and natural areas. And these are all major things that contribute to our day-to-day health, So, of course, when you degrade a society to that level, how can we expect anybody to take environmentalism seriously when it's been reduced to something that is just a fashionable thing to do? And I'm not trying to discourage anybody for taking the steps that they are taking to be better in their life and interactions with the earth. But I do want to question sometimes the motives of people, like especially greenwashing businesses that are in there for just a quick buck or in there for the hype and not really there to help the communities that they're in. I mean, all of this, sustainable jewelry, sustainable clothing, or, these fancy teas and all of this stuff. These are not accessible to so many people in our country alone, in Los Angeles alone. But it's more than just being able to live a sustainable lifestyle. Our health greatly depends on being around these environments. Our health greatly depends on being able to exercise and have less polluted air quality, in being able to have access to clean drinking water. I mean, we live in a developed nation, the strongest and richest nation in the world, and yet Flint, Michigan still, which I might add is a predominantly African American community, still does not have access to clean drinking water. Just think about it. And we talk about individual responsibility so many times. So many times people are like, oh, well, it's your responsibility to consume less. It's your responsibility to be better. And yes, I agree. We all need to take individual responsibility in, doing the things that we can, buying things that are reusable, upcycling, recycling, repurposing, all of this stuff. Like, it is our responsibility. But we also need to look at the major corporations that are the biggest polluters and contributors to environmental degradation in the world. I mentioned two earlier, Nike and Disney, for their fast fashion and just their heavy pollution in all of the other industries that they partake in. But then you also look at all of the oil companies like BP Oil, Shell Oil, ExxonMobil. All of them have had oil spills. And BP Oil specifically is their oil spill off of the Gulf of Mexico is a direct result of why the Gulf of Mexico is considered a dead zone. Like, things are barely starting to come back to life right now, and it's been decades. And what did they get? Just a small fine, because they have lobbyists, super rich and powerful lobbyists that are always going to defend their economic interests. And America is no longer a democracy. We are a country that hides behind democracy, but really it's whoever is wealthiest can pay out our politicians, and that way they can get away with whatever it is that they want. And this isn't directed to any political party, because I think that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are both to blame. Our two-party system has not allowed for a diversified thought, and it's also allowed for this corruption to happen. It's allowed for our candidates to have a super PACs that fund their campaigns, which in turn protects them from so many regulations that should be happening. And it's why our country is so divided right now. I mean, we're caught between a difficult choice of two candidates in their 80s that no one really wants and no one really likes or trusts. And what is the result of that? We have more systemic oppression. We haven't solved anything from the civil rights from the 60s. I mean, if you listen to the talks and the speeches of the Washington March that recently happened this past weekend, I urge you all to listen to it and watch it because it was very moving. And it's also just very sad. It's very sad that George Floyd's brother had to go up there and tell the leaders that now it is their time to listen to us amidst his tears. He was holding back tears and had to relive this trauma over and over again and retell this story over and over again so that people would just get the fucking message. And who knows if they'll even listen. And it's not just that speech, but it's the speeches of Martin Luther King and all of the people that have Rosa Parks and all of the people that have fought for equality and justice since before the 60s, but even in the 60s, and we're still fighting for the same things today. Nothing has changed. I mean, there has been some progress, but it's not enough. The 60s is 70 years ago. And why are we still facing public lynchings today? It's 2020. We don't have time. There have been multiple reports that the world is going to reach a breaking point in 12 years. In 12 years, we are going to reach a point where we cannot go back. And we're still fighting about whether or not human lives deserve dignity. If we can't even decide, if we can't even agree that every life and every soul deserves respect, the right to life, liberty, and freedom, which is the basic tenets of our country, how can we expect our politicians to care about non-sentient things like plants and the ocean? They don't. I mean, Trump, he just allowed another pipeline to be built down Alaska. Who knows when that's going to spill over? And of course, which lands do they build that on? The Native American lands. In South Dakota, people were tear gassed and burnt down because they were protesting the building of this pipeline in their lands, because they know that there will be no regulation in the upkeep of these pipelines, and eventually it's going to affect them. This is exactly what happened when BP oil spilled. According to this Washington Post article, BP's cost or time-saving decisions without considering contingencies and mitigation were contributing causes of the Macondo blowout. Investigators found that BP management rewarded employees for cost-saving steps and did not reward them in the same way for increasing safety. This just goes to show that companies don't really care about the safety of the people, of the environment, of the local area, and even of their workers, which 11 of them died when the BP oil spill actually happened back in 2010. So the only thing that they care about is the bottom line. That's it. That's all companies and corporations ever care about, because they're not humans. They're not actual human entities, but they're treated like one. So it's just a little frustrating all the way around, but I did not want to leave this with a sour note in all of our heads, I suppose. I really do believe that the world is going through a monumental change in history and time right now. I think that people are starting to wake up, especially with the readily available alternative news sources like Twitter, like podcasts, like even just independent news media on YouTube and other sites and blogs and things like that. People are able to make their own decisions and their own ideas, or make up their own minds about the facts that are given to them. And of course, we also live in a world where propaganda is easily and readily available too. But I have faith in the future generations that they will be critical thinkers in order to progress and move forward. My issue, though, is that I don't think that it's happening enough. And I think that we need to step up right now and be better global citizens for the sake of our planet and for the sake of the people that are living in it. Again, we cannot even think about environmentalism or talk about environmentalism until we start talking about the communities that these devastating environmental disasters actually affect. Places like Puerto Rico are still struggling from the effects from Hurricane Maria. I mean, even New Orleans still hasn't fully recovered from the hurricane that hit them a decade ago. It's absolutely ridiculous how you look at these communities and you don't feel empathy. And yes, I'm talking about the current administration and the current politicians that just don't seem to give a fuck. But we can always pressure people into doing the right things. The goal is to move Earth Overshoot Day to December 31st. But in order to do that, first, we must be taking individual accountability and take individual actions in being better citizens and better sustainably in our wellness and in the things that we do in our day-to-day life. This means not giving in to capitalism, not giving in to heavy consumerism. Buy what you need, reuse, repurpose, reduce, and recycle. And of course, all the other mantras I'm sure we've all heard of 1,000 times. On top of that, not supporting companies that on top of that, not supporting companies that deliberately pollute our planet. There's a list of companies that you could literally Google that will show you their ethical policies when it comes to free labor laws and the way that they conduct their businesses through environmentalism. Thirdly, we need to be pushing our politicians in being better. We need to fund organizations that are fighting for activism, for social justice and climate justice. And we also need to be pushing our politicians to fight for the bills that will be directly impacting our communities. If you're curious about solutions that you can implement in your lives to #MoveTheDate, visit overshootday.org/solutions. I found this site while I was researching for this podcast episode to see what we can do in order to help our communities and just be better in our carbon footprint in general. And I found that they found or have listed very creative and doable solutions for people every single day. On top of that, there's also a really great site that I found. I find it to be an incredible source and wealth of information, and it literally lists all of the different bills that are being discussed, passed or not passed, or, talked about in Congress right now, which of those representatives are the proposers of those bills, which are supporting them, so you get a better idea of which ones of your elected officials are actually fighting for you. And it's not just environmental laws, but there's also a whole host of laws and bills that you can see. I'm going to leave that link down in the description below, so you guys can go ahead and check that out as well. And lastly, I think that our money is also our most important tool when it comes to moving change or creating change. And so we need to start funding organizations that will be helping our communities. On NAACP's website, and I will leave this link for you guys as well, they actually listed a whole list of environmental justice organizations that not only work for sustainability, but also they work for the empowerment of minority communities all over the country. And there's a whole list of them, so you can go ahead and check that out, see which one best resonates with you, and go ahead and donate, because that's the best way that you can help. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the bills that I found that I thought was very interesting, because again, there's so many things that people are doing every single day that we don't ever highlight or talk about. And there's two bills that I think are so cool, and I really hope that they manage to pass through Congress. One of them is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act of 2019, and it's sponsored by Debbie Dingell of Michigan. And they are to allocate supplemental funds for the management of fish and wildlife species to increase conservation. There's also the Extinction Prevention Act of 2019 by Raul Grijalva, which is to create dedicated funds to conserve butterflies in North America, plants in the Pacific Islands, freshwater mussels in the United States, and desert fish in the Southwest United States. There's so many other bills out there like this, so all you guys got to do is just click on the link that I'm going to provide for you in the description and check that out and just inform yourselves. And of course, last but not least, the most comprehensive piece of legislation out there when it comes to economic viability and sustainability is the Green New Deal. And I think that if you guys don't know what the Green New Deal is, definitely go ahead and check that out. John Oliver actually has an amazing episode dedicated entirely to the Green New Deal. And you have elected officials like Bernie Sanders, Rashida Tlaib, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually, what's the word I'm looking for? Supporting it. They're supporting those bills. And if you like those guys and their policies, which I personally do, because I find that they all have very progressive platforms, definitely go ahead and check that out too, and just better inform yourselves on what laws are actually being passed in our state and local legislatures, as well as the federal level, so we can just know what to support, and whom we're going to be electing. Because right now, there is the presidential election, which is obviously very important, but in 2 years, it's the midterms, and that's when we actually get to elect our local officials. And a lot of these people are going to be running again for re-election, and we just got to vote out anybody that just has any type of corrupt history, because they are in government to serve, not in there to enrich themselves and their buddies and their billionaire friends. That's not the job of the government, and we need to take back what is rightfully ours. And on that note, I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me on Chapter 5 of Earth's Narrative. Special thanks to lighting director Rocio de la Grana and audio engineer Francisco Echeverri. I will see you guys next week. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and also rate us on Apple Podcasts if you haven't already, because it helps us other people find the show. 5 stars, no less. Okay, go donate and help make the world a greener, better, safer place for everybody. Bye.